So the Giller Prize, the biggest literary prize in Canada, is sponsored by Scotiabank. And what happened a few days ago is more than 24 Canadian authors launched a protest because of a Scotiabank investment in an Israeli weapons manufacturer. Today on the podcast, where does the Giller Prize go from here? I'm Alamin Abdel-Mahmoud. This is Commotion. Listen, more than 30 authors are pulling their books from consideration for the Giller Prize. They're protesting Scotiabank's investment in an Israeli defense company, among other things, which makes you wonder if some authors don't want anything to do with Canada's richest literary prize. What's it really worth to Canadian literature? Now, organizers of the Gillers are sticking with their lead sponsor, which is Scotiabank. They say that they have no plans to part ways with Scotiabank. So today we're asking, what is the path forward for the Giller Prize? Omar El-Akkad is one of the authors who says he wants nothing to do with the Gillers. He won the prize in 2021. Omar started out by telling me why he added his name to the list of authors who are protesting.
Yeah, I was asked to do it, and I think, like a number of authors, I felt that I had been misled, a few weeks earlier about the direction that the organizers were going to go in. I think from the very beginning, I've been in the position that what I wanted from the organizers was for them to say something. If you're fully on board with what's happening and with where that money's coming from and all the rest of it, say so. To get the indication earlier on that this so-called decoupling or dismantling of systems was happening, and then to get a random statement in the paper saying, well, no, actually, we've decided to side with the bank, felt a little bit like a betrayal. Mm-hmm. But also, I've never been in a position where I've had to figure out how to do without millions of dollars in funding. And so maybe they made the decision that was right for them. But as far as I was concerned, that was sort of a severance that began not so much from my end, but sort of had to happen at that point.
I want to maybe zero in on the order of operations there for a moment, because it sounds like for at least a brief moment in time, you thought the organizers were going to maybe go in a different direction. Was that the impression that you were under?
That was certainly the impression that I was under, and I know it's the impression that a number of other writers were under. Yeah. One of the difficulties about sort of discussing this thing is that you have conversations and you're on email threads and all the rest of it.
Sure.
And you don't necessarily want to go on air and sort of betray people's confidence. But I can say, and I think a lot of writers have said, that we were under the impression that something else was going to happen. And certainly writers have suggested other ways to move forward. Yeah. They're not ways that are going to buy you the ballroom at the Four Seasons every year, maybe, but they were alternative ideas. And in the end, it appears that none of those made any difference whatsoever.
The struggle between art and commerce is not a new thing. We are going to talk about that in just a second. But first, can we just put into perspective this whole thing? What did winning $100,000 do for you as an author? What did it do for you when you won this prize?
Yeah, it's interesting because that's always the way it's framed when I'm asked about this. And I've said many, many times, and I'll continue to say, that winning the Giller changed my life in every way possible.
Yeah.
The money was the least of it. Most of the money is still sitting in the bank. In fact, the most of that money that I've spent is taxes on that money, because I'm a dual citizen and the U.S. charges taxes on prize money, whereas Canada doesn't.
Sure. Having
the money is a kind of stability. Having it sitting there in a bank account is a kind of stability, of course.
Yeah.
But in terms of actually going out and buying a Maserati or something, that never happened.
Sure.
The ways in which it did change my life were, first of all, it saved my career. I had this book that nobody cared about, and then suddenly everybody cared about it. Also, it gave me a kind of confidence and everything that you would expect from winning an award of that magnitude. But more than that, and this is so minor to talk about the idea of grief in this context, and I apologize in advance because this is such a petty thing, but that was a really good day. I think you were there, right?
I was there
at that ceremony, and I got up and I had I was convinced Miriam Toews was going to win.
Yeah.
I had no speech prepared. I don't know what the hell I said when I got up there.
Yeah.
But it was this really good memory for me.
Yeah.
And now it will forever be intertwined in this mess. And now we'll always be sort of inseparable from this situation where, at least in my feeling, these folks who I thought really, really cared about writers, and probably will say that they care really deeply about writers, opted for this bank. And that sucks, but, I'll get over it.
I don't think that sounds petty. Just for what it's worth, I don't think that sounds petty. I mean, like, you're talking about a life-transforming moment. You're talking about a moment of, I think you had your mom there, when you won, like, that's a really special moment, a really special achievement. So it sounds like you are at least a little bit in mourning of what the Giller Prize maybe represented, and it feels like it represents something different to you right now.
So here's the thing. And again, I apologize in advance for sort of going dark.
It's okay, man.
The last time that I talked to anybody from the Gillers, which was a few weeks ago, that morning, I woke up and the first thing I saw when I turned on my computer was photographic evidence of what it looks like when a 6-year-old girl starves to death. Now, I have a daughter about that age. And I think you might as well.
I do.
And I have a story like that for every single day of the last 9 months. And I realize as I'm telling you this, that maybe some of this doesn't make it to air because it'll be upsetting for your listeners. Not the act itself, not the men being raped to death at torture camps or the guy with Down syndrome who was just mauled to death by dogs. Not the acts themselves, but having to hear about them. But I bring it up because this is the way that I have seen the world. This is the prism through which I have seen the world for the past 9 months. And in that context, I don't really care what happens with the killers. Right? It doesn't matter. They're going to be fine. Mm-hmm. They've got a bank supporting them. I bet you that for every author who signed that letter, there's probably 10 authors who just want all of this to go away so that they can put on their nice suits and show up every fall at the Four Seasons or whatever and continue to celebrate because it's a fun night out. I get all of that. But from my personal perspective, I think of what the Palestinian poet Rasha Abdul Hadi said about anything you can do to throw sand in the gears of genocide, you should do it. And in that context, trying to pressure this award to break with a company that is investing in an Israeli weapons maker makes perfect sense. And I still hope it happens in some form or another. But we are talking about this bizarre side drama in the world of Canadian literature that in the grand scheme of things feels so small.
Mm-hmm. I think I can imagine somebody listening to this conversation and thinking that is absolutely true. The idea that there is no comparison of the scale of the suffering that we get to see every single day when you turn on a computer, when you look at the news any moment, and talking about this drama that is, inside the Canadian literature world. I can also imagine somebody who listens to this conversation and say, well, the Gillers tried to sort of divest themselves away from this particular universe. I should give the context that, like, the Giller's executive director, Alana Rabinovich, one of the things that she said, systems take time to dismantle. That is a quote that she had said that you mentioned earlier. And in the spirit of whatever that is, the Scotiabank subsidiary that we're talking about, it has divested half of its stock in Albert Systems, which is a weapons manufacturer that we're talking about. So it reduces the value from $500 million invested in this war to $237 million. Does that make any difference?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, I have no access to any kind of information from Bay Street or how these decisions are being made.
Sure.
My guess is that this is probably going to continue to happen. My strong suspicion is, like every other corporation on the planet, Scotiabank is not particularly interested in morals or the ethically correct thing to do, that rather this is a business decision. And if at some point your one investment is starting to be offset by the amount of negative attention you're getting, then maybe it makes financial sense to do something about that. There's a good chance that this continues to happen, and then at one point they fully divest. And then everybody who was on board with this decision to stick with the bank can come out and say, see, we knew what we were doing all along, that we were playing the long game, and now you still get to have your fancy award at the hotel, and we didn't have to do this very drastic step that you were asking for. And I can see this playing out exactly that way over the next few months, over the next year, whatever it is. I do feel like that way of getting to the end point is still leaves the impression that when artists made these demands based on moral concerns, that they were largely disregarded in favor of a more pragmatic solution. Mm-hmm. Again, sand in the gears of genocide. I'll take any win I can get. And we should say, sorry, I know this is a rambling answer, but we should say that the reason any of this is happening has almost nothing to do with people like me. I did nothing. This has to do with activists who've been working on this for years, and including and especially the activists who rushed the stage at the ceremony last year,
Sure.
Who are the reason I know about any of this.
Right.
And who, as a result of their work and for their efforts, now face the prospect of possibly having their lives ruined. So there has been, and there will probably continue to be, real damage done to people's lives as we reach this conclusion that that a lot of artists and a lot of activists have been calling for a very long time.
I think there's a tension in the middle of this conversation about the hypothetical versus the very, very material and very, very real. One of the hypotheticals that people like to engage in is this idea of like, okay, if not Scotiabank, then who, right? How do you navigate that question? Like, what makes for a good and decent sponsorship, private sponsorship of art? Or should we even be avoiding that question altogether, do you think?
Yeah, that's the crux of it, right? Because that question can be asked in good faith and it can be asked in bad faith as well.
Yes, it can.
This notion of as soon as you start advocating for any kind of change, well, how dare you? Who made the shoes that you're wearing? You know, that sort of thing.
Sure.
I can tell you my personal threshold, which is a corporation that profits off of mass slaughter. I can tell you other people's thresholds that they've explained to me, which has everything from any corporate involvement to any corporate involvement, effectively, right? Like I won't do it if there's any corporate involvement, or I'm happy to do it regardless of corporate involvement. Both those ends of the spectrum are available. I'm in no position to judge any other artists where they stand on that. Yeah. And I should say that, you know, I've seen a lot of names on these open letters. I know a lot of these writers are broke. I know they're struggling to make ends meet, and I know it makes a huge, huge difference when you get this fellowship named after some corporate titan who did horrible, horrible things decades ago, or you get that residency or whatever it is, right? And it sucks that the people in the position to be on the front lines of this kind of activism are the ones who have so much to lose and essentially so little to lose as well. If you are all for the status quo, you are banking on a kind of breaking apart of the progressive agenda based on people's personal thresholds. I can guarantee you that if one of these awards that was being criticized for having a relationship with a bank came out the next day and said, okay, we've left this bank, we've gone to another bank that was just as problematic, there would be some artists who would say, good enough for me, let's go back to the ballroom. Yeah. The thing I keep coming back to is this idea of, when are you going to be satisfied? You know, when are you going to be happy? Why are you still complaining about this? Which I get. People get bored of this stuff. And every activist who is passionate about something at some point or another comes out sounding shrill and sounding unpleasant and sounding like they want to bum you out. And I get all of that. But if we've created a society where even basic involvement in an institutional arts organization feels so troublesome and so morally burdensome that someone like me, who's not a particularly ethical person, if I'm being honest, who's not some saint, is having trouble engaging with any of it, then I think that is much more a glaring indictment of the kind of society we've created than any personal moral threshold of my own. How did we get to a situation where every time I get an invitation to something, I now have to do an hour of detective work on who the hell is bringing the money to this? That's going to be a problem, you know, and I don't know what the answer is.
You've got 30 authors so far who've signed this letter, some of whom have written books that have come out this year, some of whom have written books that would be on the long list of the Gillers potentially. They will no longer be on that long list. I am sure that the Giller Prize will find 10 other books to put on the long list and 5 to put on the short list. That is not going to be the problem. The problem is the way that we talk about what is supposed to be the most prestigious literary prize in this country has kind of, I think, for at least the short term, changed. How do you think about the idea of this, Canadian Literary Prize, not like there's that many, suddenly sort of losing, if not esteem, then certainly, to me, some of the credibility of being able to say every book that was available actually competed this year because so many authors have withdrawn?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I think you can get away from sort of making any statement of substance, and you can keep going with this sort of narrative of we are apolitical, we don't engage in this, and you can sort of keep leaning against that particular fantasy.
Yeah.
But you can't get away from the reality of what's happening with the prize this year, right? That's not going away. The judges who dropped out aren't suddenly going to come back. You're in a position where the practical reality of this year's prize is in dire straits. And the Gillers is going to be fine, but I do feel bad for the writers. Again, you look at writers, you look at that list and you're seeing a lot of writers who are young, a lot of writers who are early in their careers, a lot of writers for whom this would be a huge deal just to be nominated for this thing, as it was for me.
Yeah.
And it sucks that their names are out in front of everybody. So not only are they walking away from potentially a lot of money and a career-changing award, but they're also probably getting a lot of angry stuff on the internet and a lot of angry letters and emails and all the rest of it, right?
Yeah.
That sucks. In terms of what this prize does moving forward, I promise you I have absolutely no animosity towards the people who run this thing. They work very, very hard on it, and I'm sure they will continue to do so. But you are in a position now where you are facing the difference between penultimate consequences and ultimate consequences. Money is always going to be a penultimate consequence. If you have to hold an award show in your basement because you can't afford that ballroom at the hotel anymore, that sucks, but it's a penultimate consequence. If you have to hold that award in your basement because nobody's showing up because writers have turned away from your award, that is an ultimate consequence. Right? An arts organization might be able to survive without as much money. I don't know that an arts organization can survive without artists.
Listen, Omar, part of my job is to imagine the most generous listener, and the most generous listener is listening to you thinking this is a conflicted author who's working through a lot of questions and has kind of found his own moral threshold. The least generous listener has kind of clocked the idea that you have most of the prize money sitting in the bank account and is perhaps yelling at the radio, Omar, why haven't you given the money back? And I don't know what you say to that person, but maybe you have an answer.
Yeah, it's funny because you and I both know who that least generous listener is. I love the way you prefaced that, by the way. That was such incredible hostmanship, if that's a word.
Thanks, Ben.
So again, we've had these conversations, and one of the reasons that it's really infuriating to be in this position is that I can't tell you the exact nature of exactly the thing you're talking about and what the response was.
Yeah.
We have said time and again that there's a version of this that works with writer support. And that has gone out the window now, I think. Maybe it hasn't. I don't know. I'm not privy to every single conversation. The answer I would have given to that question a few weeks ago would have been directly related to that idea of how the Giller Prize could function in a way that isn't directly related on a bank that's investing in an Israeli weapons maker.
So you're implying you would have given some of your prize money towards...
I personally would have given the rest of it. The answer I give you now is no. I'm not going to do that. And I should say that at no point have I been asked to do that. And in fact, the opposite is true. The idea of writers putting their money towards this has been particularly difficult for some of the organizers of the Giller to accept. And I think that's for good faith reasons. I think they're really troubled by this notion of asking writers to do this. The other part of it is that if I'm going to give that money away, I'm not going to give it to the Gillers. I'm going to give it to somebody who's working with all those kids who've been dismembered on the other side of the planet. So I think that argument is always going to be made. Like, hey, give the money back. What, you're going to stand on your high horse. You're going to sit on your high horse and talk all of this stuff about morality and ethics, give the money back. And I get it. I absolutely get it. And as of not so long ago, there was a part of me that was really sort of in that place. And I don't think I'm there anymore. And I understand that people are going to listen to this and think like, oh, he wants to keep the money for himself. Like that's never going to go away.
Yeah.
But I also think it's a fundamentally bad faith argument. This notion that everyone should do what I did and keep the money in a bank account for 3 years after winning it on the off chance that a giant moral dilemma takes over the prize. Again, it comes from this place of, you think you're better than me? Like, you think you're going to stand here and do this? Well, how about this hypocrisy? But there are so many ways in which I'm a giant hypocrite. So many ways. I don't think that the ultimate end goal of that line of questioning is to get the money back to the Gillers or to instill some kind of moral purity on the situation. I think the end goal is to silence a person you disagree with. Mm-hmm. Oh, well, you continue to do this. Why don't you give the money back? Why don't you stop putting your books on Amazon? Why don't you take your books out of Indigo? Why don't you stop talking? Why don't you shut the hell up? I think is the end goal of that particular line of questioning. Mm-hmm. And look, if I thought it worked for me, I would probably take the same check. But it's really infuriating to try and give you a full answer to that question and not betray the confidence of these conversations we've had. There are other writers, I can tell you, who still hold out the hope for a vastly different way of getting this award to work. Unfortunately, I'm not one of them anymore, but I wish them all the luck in the world.
There's a lot to sit with just in that answer alone. But if I can just emphasize to people how extraordinary it is that even for a moment, you or other writers were considering giving some of your own money towards the sustainability of a prize. Maybe it's not this prize, maybe it's a separate prize, but that's extraordinary because this is not a profession that makes a lot of money for most people. Like the figure was like under $13,000 a year in Canada is how much a lot of writers end up making. And so that's an extraordinary thing to consider. So I want to, thank you for bringing that forward. And also, I just want to thank you for being here, man.
Oh, it's always a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Omar Al-Ekkad's new book, One Day Everyone Will Have Always Been Against This, will be published next year. He won the Giller Prize in 2021. We asked to speak to Ilana Rabinovich. She's the executive director of the Scotiabank Giller Prize, but she declined our request for an interview. But she did provide the following statement, which I'm going to read in full for you now. The Giller Foundation's focus is on literary excellence. No one is compelled to enter or adopt a political position as part of a process that is set up to celebrate Canadian literature. If protesters wish to demonstrate for or against government policy or comment on world events, the Giller Foundation respects their right to speak freely, but the foundation is not set up to be an advocacy organization for anything other than excellence in Canadian writing. That's a statement that we received from Ilana Rabinovich, the executive director of the Giller Prize. For more on this story, go to cbcnews.ca. I'm Al-Amin Abdul-Mahmoud, and this is Commotion. Listen, that is it for the podcast today, but before we go, I just want to just shift gears and tell you about what we're going to do on this show tomorrow. I don't know if you've heard Katy Perry's new single, Woman's World. It's off this new album that she has coming out called 143. The song came out last week, and the video shows Katy Perry dressed as Rosie the Riveter and a bionic woman. But the critics are slamming this video. Some are calling it more bore than a roar, if you will. It's been described as a serious streaming disappointment. The song has feminist messaging, but some people are questioning why the dancers are dressed in revealing outfits and appealing to the male gaze. Katy Perry has had to defend the video in a post to Instagram.
And we're kind of just having fun, being a bit sarcastic with it. It's very slapstick and very on the nose. And with this set, it's like, we're not about the male gaze, but we really are about the male gaze.
So that's Katy Perry. She's also been criticized for teaming up with Dr. Luke to work on this album. We're going to talk about all of these things tomorrow on the show, so I hope that you can be here. In the meantime, that is it for the podcast. You can find us on YouTube. You can find us on Instagram. We are at Commotion CBC. My name is Alamin Abdul Mahmoud. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you tomorrow.